Thank you so much, Stan, and for this invitation. We would like to focus on a special case study and try to derive some consequences. Let me first of all tell you how this talk is organized. It's in three parts. I will outline the description of the syntactic domain, and Cristiano will offer the empirical results from the computational perspective and derive some conclusion. Of course, a preliminary step when one has to reflect on syntax and parsing is to actually reflect on competence and performance, the very fundamental dichotomy that characterizes our understanding on human language. Actually, ideally, one could say that for a theory of competence C and a theory of performance P, the minimal relation between competence and performance will be given by this kind of equation, where T is the proportional time needed to perform a derivation generated in C. Of course, this ideal situation is very hard to obtain. And let me show you why copier construction actually offer you a special ideal case study. First of all, the very idea of parsing, which actually is very interesting etymologically, as comes from the Latin pars, a part, and means actually getting information for the parts that you are exposed to. And the natural question is how much information can be obtained from the analysis of a sequence of lexical categories independently from the competence. Obviously, the traditionally rather than obviously, the evaluation of the relationship between competence and performance is measured by modulating either lexical insertion, that is the number of words, or different syntactic arrangement, as for example, the prototypical case study of subject-object relative clause. Now, in our work, Cristiano and I take an opposite direction. I would like to offer it to discussion to the audience and take advantage of this special parterre des rois that Stan organized and Luigi and all the Collège de France. The nominal copular sentences, namely sentences of the type noun phrase, DP, verb, D3, constitute an ideal field of observation since the very same sequence with the very same words instantiates two completely different structures. For the sake of simplicity, let me say that we represent the copula as a verb, although it lacks predicative force, and it can be considered as a mere spell out of T, as I was suggesting in the early version of the split info hypothesis, practically following the Aristotelian tradition. So the first step, in order to let you understand why these constructions are the ideal empirical field to test the relationship between syntax and parsing, is a reflection on the very notion, the basic notion of sentence and the configurational definition of grammatical function. This is something that, with every handbook on not only on linguistics, but also on computation starts with, namely the fact that the sentence is a combination of a binary combination of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, playing the role of a subject and a predicate. If the verb phrase, and this idea of defining the functional notion in configurational terms has remained a constant in the evolution of Chomsky's concepts and is one of the important contributions he has made to syntactic theory, as Giulio Lepsky noticed in his influential history of linguistics. Of course, the structure of the VP can be complex, so you actually have a sequence with the noun phrase, a verb, and the noun phrase when the verb allows it to have more than one noun phrases. It's not intransitive. Now, the reason why linguists, starting from the early tradition, accept the idea that the two noun phrases are asymmetric relies on very many empirical facts. One of the prototypical one is extraction from the noun phrase. So, for example, if you have a sentence like a picture of the wall revealed the cause of the riot, implementing noun phrase, verb, noun phrase, if you try to subtract from the noun phrase that follows the verb, you have a grammaticality judgment of acceptability, which riot you think a picture of the wall revealed the cause of. And if you try to subtract from the subject position, you have a degraded result. Which will you take a picture of reveal the cause of the riots. This is, in other words, one of the distinctive asymmetries between preverbal and postverbal NPs in the sequence NP-VP is that extraction from the postverbal NP is possible, whereas it's not so from the preverbal one. Now, copular sentences immediately constitute a surprising anomaly in this accepted representation of the asymmetry. And the reason why it is so can be shown in very many situations. One of the typical one is subtraction. Consider these two copular constructions. They have exactly the same sequence. A picture of the wall was the cause of the riot. The cause of the riot was a picture of the wall. But if you try to subtract, in one case, it patterns exactly as intransitive. Which riot do you think a picture of the wall was the cause of? Whereas in the other case, which wall do you think that the cause of the riot was a picture of? It's completely ungrammatical. The reason, in other words, a typical asymmetry displayed in sentence structure sequence fails to show in one of the member of those pair where the two NPs commute around the copula. To cut a long story short, this representation, when it comes to the copula that can be expanded in this way, has generated this kind of representation where the subject is simply moved from the internal position to the surface position. It's a very long story that starts at least in the generative grammar from the study of Retrouvez in 1975. And so there is a long line of observation. And for those who are interested in the history of this analysis, this is a collection of things. Now, one of the possibilities to try to explain the anomaly is, in fact, to abandon one single axiom of this representation. In other words, the crucial step that I proposed many years ago was to abandon the axiom that preverbal NPs plays the role of a subject of predication and allow them to play the role of predicates. In other words, that is to abandon this single fact. And if it is true, then we can actually have that the very same sequence, as I noticed from the start, can be an instance of either a canonical sentence where the subject, as has been traditionally analyzed, moves from one position to the higher position, and the other where it's the opposite situation, that is where the predicate raises from one position to the other. This single fact has a lot of overt manifestation across languages. Going back again to Retrouvez, one of the original observations, which is particularly important for generative grammar, is that when in French, you can say la lecture est ma passion, but you can also say la lecture c'est ma passion. Retrouvez noticed that, in fact, if you invert the two, you cannot say ma passion est la lecture, but you have to say ma passion c'est la lecture. This kind of observation this is a fragment, of course, in Retrouvez analysis was contained in a much more complex kind of result, may be manifest in other cases. This overt expletive, a pro-predicative expletive, can be manifested in Italian, for example, in a similar mutatis mutandis way. In this case, I libri sono la mia passione, literally, the books are my passion. You can have or not have a small pro, and in fact, it depends actually also on the position of I libri, depending whether it is focalized, for example, alla Rizzi in a left periphery. But it's clearly the case that when you have the inversion, you have to have a pro-predicative element, because otherwise you cannot explain why the first noun phrase doesn't trigger agreement on the second. There is a lot of further prediction of this idea of inverse versus copular. Just I'm not going to read through that because this will be just a simple catalog of possibilities that many linguists have analyzed. But there is one single fact that I would like to focus on, and this will give Cristiano the possibility to show how machine can understand this actually the way that humans do with copular construction. Let me focus on one single example, which is a fragment of the structure that reflects on locality. The unified theory of copular sentences assimilates the structural position of postverbal noun phrases in inverse copular sentences to the preverbal subject in transitive in normal predicates, allowing us to extend the locality condition to both construction. Here I just cited two ways of looking at things, which actually converging, but are based on different observations, as Luigi and I have discussed for many times. But anyway, this is the structure. As you see here, you have practically the same kind of configuration where you have the subject of the copular construction, and here you have the subject of a preverbal predicate. In both cases, the subjects are contained in a functional structure and are dominated by or that which is the complement of either the verb in the sense of a copula or the complementizer. Now, to get a full picture of how the situation is, we should actually also consider existential sentences. That is, those sentences that involve there. So as with the cause of the right is a picture of the wall, you can say there was a picture of the wall, where the predicate, it's not the cause of the riot, but it's the pro-predicative element, locative element there. In this case, you still have which wall do you think that the cause of the riot was a picture of, which is impossible. But surprising in the surprise, we do have the possibility to subtract into their construction, which wall do you think there was a picture of? And this one of the possibilities to adopt some version of el marking alla cinque, provided that in the minimalist framing has to be reformalized. So in other words, this the structure that you have here, una foto del muro which in an existential construction, is just explained by assuming that the predicate is incorporated in the copula, and the copula derivatively acquires the selectional properties of a predicate. So in a nutshell, in this first part, what I would like to show you is the same sequence of two DP, VDP with the same words implementing a completely different structure. Copular sentences, in fact, offer an ideal empirical field to test competence, performance, parsing, and processing, since the very same minimal sequence instantiates a very different structure generated by the simple compositional operation of syntax. And now let me give the palcoscenico to Cristiano for offering important observation on the part of parsing.
Thank you, Andrea. Let me share my screen. You should see everything. Okay, so apparently we have a pretty good grammatical description, and this grammatical description should allow us to implement a computer program that digests our expectation and produce what we expect to be the performance of the native speaker with respect to the subtraction in copular construction. Well, unfortunately, the step is not that direct. We have to make some extra. So it doesn't move. Why that? Okay, I move it. So we need a full algorithmic implementation of this constraint, which required quite some effort that we will see in a second. That's a necessary step because we want to understand if our overall computational system is computable or not. And that's also the topic of this conference. We want to have a linking theory, which is an old-fashioned computational model, which is very categorical, based on space and time classic complexity measure. And we want actually this model to be able to predict some difficulty effort in processing copular construction. And we want to aim both at prediction which are offline, acceptability judgment, grammaticality judgment, but also answering comprehension question, and online, reading time, fixation, whatever evidence you find from a psycholinguistic point of view should fit with this model. So if you look at the classic context-free grammar-like description, you definitely realize that the constraint Andrea quickly mentioned before, are not easily implemented. In the 80s and the 90s, there are a lot of little updates that suggest that we can actually modify specific part of the context-free grammar description, and we can obtain the kind of constraint that we want. But unfortunately, there still remain a pretty declarative competence description. That means you have your competence description, but then you have to implement some algorithm, parsing, processing algorithm, parsing and generation. They should be different and use the knowledge, the descriptive knowledge. A failure in your prediction might be related to a failure in competence description or in a failure on implementing a specific algorithm. So that's not a perfect situation. So you have this ambiguity. You don't know if your algorithm is wrong or your competence description is wrong. So let's summarize very quickly the relevant knowledge Andrea suggested before and see what kind of minimal description we want, minimal constraint we want to implement in our model. So first of all, the copula is not the predicate, but one of the two DPs behave as a predicate, one NP is the fact. Both DPs can move in a precopular position, and it's only possible to sub-extract from the predicate DPs in the base position, in the lower copular position. That's the idea. So as usual, in a set theoretic approach, it aims at descriptive adequacy, Charles Young suggested before, we actually care about generability of a specific sentence. In our prediction are strictly binary. Either a sentence is generable by our knowledge or is not generable. And that's if we have two factors, copular type, inverse, and canonical, and extraction site, predicate, and subject. We have four possibilities, and the first one is the all the above. We use Italian for various reasons, more complex and more interesting, but we can say something about English as well later. Okay, we gathered some acceptability judgment. That's I basically talk about for matter of reasonable spaces when we talk about offline grammaticality judgments. Acceptability, in fact, that's a 7-point Likert scale. Here you have the acceptability judgment of speaker from canonical sentence, and here you have the normalized acceptability for inverse sentences sub-extraction. That's the sub-extraction from the blue, from the subject, and then from the predicate. So you can draw an imaginary line which represent your grammaticality judgment. And on that, you get the grammatical sentence, below then ungrammaticality. Well, unfortunately, that's related to the Charles Young previous comment. What we see that, I mean, all factors are very significant in our analysis. That means the native speakers perceive as significantly different each condition. So if a grammar is able to predict this contrast, it's definitely a better grammar, more explanatory adequate in the classic sense. So how do we do? Well, an easy trick usually linguists try to play is to count the number of violations in the ungrammatical domain. And if you violate more constraints, your acceptability should be lower. That unfortunately doesn't work pretty well if you assume, as Andrea quickly mentioned, a subject island constraint. That means it's essentially you can't extract from the subject. And we have to say a lot about that, but let's assume a categorical distinction between subject island and criteria freezing, which is, as Luigi Rizzi suggested, you move an element in a criteria position and this element is frozen. You can't sub-extract anything. You have two violations. So this the extraction, the sub-extraction from the canonical, from the predicate on a canonical, from the subject on a canonical subject should be very bad, worse than in these two cases in the inverse subject extraction, in which you have a simple violation either of a subject item or a criteria freezing, if they are distinct. If they are not distinct, you should say, in fact, why one is scored so lower than the other. So we have two paths. One path is to look at performance, probability, etc. The other path is to try to squeeze our competence model and to see if there are some juicy idea that we would like to apply. That's obviously the second path that we try to pursue here. We try to use minimalism. Minimalism, as Luigi Rizzi presented very clearly in the introduction yesterday, is a sort of reaction to the complexity of the constraint proposed in the 80s and the 90s. We aim at having a very simple Straccioni procedure, which is based on merge, gluing two elements together. And in order to do that, we have to use features. That's at least the Stabler's implementation that we will see have a lot of computational advantage. One of it is computable and equivalent with what we know to be a mildly context-sensitive grammars. So we use standard category, determiner, noun, verb, tense, and we use the selection then to determine if the two elements can merge together. And then we use a two other set of category, licensor or licensees, or probe golden, more recent minimalist terms to deal with non-local dependencies. Well, that's how a lexicon looks like. You have the word that you find in a sentence and an ordered list of features taken from categories that should be processed in this specific order. As you see, the lexicon is pretty rich. You can also have empty elements and other weak characters that we'll discuss in a second. So why we should care about minimalism? So a good point Stabler raised in this 2013 paper is that minimalism can reduce the redundancy in the lexicon. How do we do? Well, we can represent this string of elements in an hierarchical way, tree-like way, with mode cycle if needed. You can route pictures, for instance, from left to right, and you find picture here from the bottom, from the top of the tree. That's a very nice way that you use to try to implement some sort of relativized minimality, which unfortunately we are not able to discuss here precisely. Also to derive some binding property, which actually was discussed in a paper by Philippe Schlenker, non-redundancy, quite a few years ago, and Valentina Bianchi as well. Okay, how do we implement the structural building operation at minimalism? Well, it's very simple. We can glue two elements together if and only if A and B has this feature compatible. So one selected the other, and that's how it visualizes in standard minimalism. So you have the two element gluing, and then you have these angle brackets indicating the one which is the head of the constituents, the label, if you want to call it. And you keep going. As soon as you find a prominent licensor or a probe, you are forced to inspect your sister node and to pick up the first unlicensed element and to bring it with you, re-merge it in a higher position. That's how we derive minimal link condition is implemented by the search strategy, and that's pretty sound, correct, and pretty good. So the problem is, how do we implement copular construction in minimalist terms? So it's not straightforward. I would like to pose your attention just three little problems which make me solve it, but just to give you the level of complexity and technical details that we need to concentrate on. So we build the first part, in this case, the predicate, up to this point, but then we have to stop. Because if you want to create the small clause, well, the other constituent should be built. That's what we call a parallel workspace. And notice that the minimal difference that suggests that this is the subject, will be the subject, that will be the predicate, is an extra select feature. So this element cause will select the other, and then you keep going like that in having a D. Notice in this configuration, you don't have a small clause. You have a D, so the copula should select D. You have an advantage of having a clear predicative relation between this noun phrase and this other, but also you have a problem. So if you create an inverse sentence, you would pipe the whole sentence. You would create something like the picture of the wall cause of the riot, which is not what you want. So either you assume that the subject should be evacuated before creating the inverse sentence, which is plausible, or else you adopt the small clause hypothesis. Well, the small clause hypothesis requires some little modification of your grammar. It's doable, but unless it's an extra stipulation. And more important, you lose the ability actually to use the select feature directly from the noun. Once you have that, however, if you want to derive movement through case checking, then you have another problem, because apparently feature-driven case checking require a feature related to D. So you have a minus case feature either on the subject and on the predicate, which is correct, because you can move both as we want to implement. But if you move one and you leave the other one here, the sentence will be ungrammatical because the other feature is unchecked. So the idea that quickly discussed on the symmetry trigger movement is actually more felicitous in this specific context if we accept the small clause idea. So another problem is related to Italian. And the fact that as we define movement as feature-driven, we pick up the first available WH feature, which is the D here. So we will extract, as in English, which will, leaving the preposition stranded. That's actually not something that you can do in Italian. And actually, what you should do is move of which will at the beginning of the sentence. So we discussed with Valentina Bianchi, in which we refined the things I will show in a minute, we discussed many times, many papers. That's actually, it's a very interesting phenomenon in English as well. Sometimes you should pipe in the preposition, some other time you should leave it here. And that's actually, we should predict what is the constraint that force leaving the preposition strand in the position and bring it with you. All these are technical details that can be solved with some difficulty. But now we have another problem. We still have, as in that's a derivational problem. We include a procedure for creating structure building, but then we have a paradox. We can't use directly in processing because they are building from bottom up. Well, we can use in processing, but that kind of processes that we will end up with is something that tell us if the structure is correctly built using merge and move. We give us an index that relate with the offline complexity, never possible to do incremental estimation. Nevertheless, Stabler again implement a very wonderful top-down parser, which is equivalent, use the equivalence with multiple context-free grammar, and actually is a classic problem-based traversal, which is complete, efficient. Once you do the parse set, you run the parse set to reconstruct the set of merge operation and movement operation. So the parser essentially undo movement, they undo merge, but they are not one-on-one direction. So to undo a move operation, you have at least 2 possibilities. To undo a merge operation, you have at least 4 possibilities. So that's the difference between your competence and your implementation in processing terms. But you can count things. You can count the memory usage. And what they count is the maximal tenure. So the maximum amount or number of steps an item remain in memory before being integrated, or the total tenure, the total number of steps needed to build non-trivial dependency. Now we'll see what's a non-trivial dependency. And then the filler gap tenure, how much memory you should use to fill all the gap that you created during your derivation. That's the simplest possible linking theory. We have numbers and we can compare different structural derivation. Let's see how it works. We have to move from structural tree to derivational tree, which has richer, that's the classical constituency-based tree. With movement, here we have pretty much the same node, but as you see, the elements are reconstructed in their base position, and you have index and outdex, a very small number, 1, 2, 2, 3, etc. But that gives you when the element is first postulated by the parser and when it's being licensed. And then we can keep going. The boxed one are the one paying more memory cost because they keep in memory more than 2 steps. The 2 steps are considered a trivial dependency. So let's do our little calculation, comparing canonical with inverse sentence, for instance. That's very easy. So we look at the highest and max tenure, highest element, the element that remain in memory more time before being integrated, your 8 comes from 15 minus 7, very index, outdex minus index. That's similar, exactly the same, actually, canonical inverse, the same max tenure. Some has, which is the total amount of memory you have to use, number of steps you have to keep an element in memory. That's the filler position, the filler position, that's the gap position in which you reconstructed. You simply calculate 7 minus 1, then you get 6, and then the other dependency is the copular movement to trigger agreement. Notice that in inverse copular construction, we have multiple movements. As Andrea said, in Italian, we have agreement. Agreement may be also, it should be actually force, also with the post-verbal position. So the subject nevertheless move in a peripheral, VP peripheral, and it's approximating a TP peripheral. But obviously, when you have a post-verbal, post-subject copular construction, you always have a focalized interpretation. That's an interesting point. I may raise later. Okay, that's how we calculate. The result is here. The total cost of a long-distance dependency is higher than the total cost of a long-distance dependency canonical sentence. And that's what actually we observe on acceptability judgment. Inverse copular sentence with no extraction actually are rated lower than canonical sentence. They are not equivalent. That's interesting. Let's look at the sub-extraction from canonical. Here, sub-extraction from the subject, and here from the predicate. Notice that this time, the max tenure is slightly different, but the minor difference is already relevant. So we just have a very classic approach. So we have to compare 2 metrics, and the higher one is the one who pay more in terms of cost. And that's, again, the canonical structure from subject is related to be words. As you see, there are other numbers that you can extract. According to Graph De Santo, actually I use the Graph tool for extracting these little numbers, which apply also in De Santo for many phenomena in Italian. What the result is that, in fact, the 2 other measures diverge in expectation. What they suggest, the max T is the most predictive one, and then sum as the total cost of the filler gap dependencies is the other that matter. So let's look at the extraction from the inverse sentence, from the subject and from the predicate. Here again, you have max T, which is the same, but some T and some as, which strongly diverge. So let's plot our expectation on our graph. As you see, here we replicate your grammaticality line, 8, and all the other max T are 9. So we somehow expect ungrammaticality if we rely on max T. But if you look at the other sum as, for instance, then it's the inverse prediction, exactly the inverse prediction. So summarizing, there are pro, so we are able to rank solutions that are in fact a prediction for offline performance, but this solution is only partially and not completely filled. And they are only related to offline measures. But that's a very crucial point. So that I would like to stress here. We can't use directly minimally stretchable building operation to make the consideration. That's a very indirect reconstruction. How merge and move are related with complexity. That's Shota Mom and Colin Phillips stated very clearly. Merge as thought in the standard mainstream can't be used directly, neither in parsing nor in production, and can be used as a linking idea for performance prediction. And more important, we rely, at least with metrics, we rely with memory tenure. But we know from Nama Friedman talk very clear yesterday that to relativize minimality or general intervention matter more than the amount of time you keep an element in memory, which is important, but nevertheless is, as Akhtar and other model like Lewis and Vasist propose, actually it's not the only thing. And relativized minimality, proposed by Rizzi again, is very important, more important, we want to implement. How do we do? That's the quick attempt to discuss a pretty simple model. Let's see if it's simple in 1 minute. The idea is to reverse completely the perspective of derivation of using merge and trying to work from left to right. So we include the real time in our model. And we try to stick, that actually is pretty coherent with what we said yesterday in the model that's been proposed for the expectation-based model by Roger Levy, for instance, but we want to rely only on categorical expectation. So X categorical expectation is what we use, and we want to see how far we can get with this simplest possible assumption. You have your structure and project the last expectation. You will merge an incoming element if and only if this match with your categorical expectation. If it partially matches or it doesn't match, you move in your memory buffer. So a memory buffer is some sort of flag that suggests that the element is unlicensed at position, and then you should keep it in mind to license later on. As you notice, that's what we call a phase with Valentina. I summarize some result in this paper. We have two kinds of phases. One is what we can use to drive long-distance dependency with no problem, which is the last recursive expectation. So the last expectation is the one that inherits the content of the memory buffer, and then you keep going as long as you want. All other phases, all other expectations, which comes while you're still other expectation pending, are nested phases that can receive any content. That's how we get islandhood. So let's see how it works. And notice that's not parsing, neither parsing nor generation. It's something in between. You merge an element, you expect a WH. In this case, you expect a C complementized with a WH expectation. You can start merging your WH phrase. You can expand the WH phrase. But in this case, you have a preposition, which is not licensed at position. So you move the element in the memory buffer, which is a memory buffer related to the superordinate phase. You start processing the subject. That's the derivation of a canonical reconstruction with extraction from the predicate. That should be okay. Here again, you expect a case and a D feature. You find neither, you find tense. You can keep going. You move the element in memory buffer, but then you stack your expectation one on the other. So you should expect a tense with a case licensing. Then you can go to the transparent phase, the last expectation, which is actually inclusion of B, which is coherent with tense and case licensing. You expand the nominal predicate, it's an NP, it's nominal predicate. You find cause, which in fact are the relevant select feature, and now you are free to start discharging an element from your memory buffer. So the sentence is good. So what's going on in the extraction? Let's compare canonical extraction from the subject and canonical inversion, instruction from the predicate in invert sentence. So at the beginning, you still move the element in your memory buffer because it's unselected. You find a putative subject and you move in this memory buffer, as we saw before from the derivation of canonical sentence, and you can't use, if you have a gap here, your element in memory because it's a nested phase. That's by definition, you can't inherit the content of memory buffer. You merge the copula and then the difference. So here you process the real nominal predicate, and then you can keep going. On the other hand, you find feature which is incompatible, doesn't have the select feature, qualifies as small clause as a nominal predicate. Then on the right side, on the left side, you discharge the content of the memory buffer, and the sentence is bad just because you can't integrate the WH element in the subject. On the other hand, you have to move again the element in a memory buffer, and then discharge goes, and at this point you can discharge a element. So the extraction from the inverse copular sentence with the predicate subextraction is harder with respect to the extraction from the subject for this reason. So let's compare, that was the final step, from the extraction from the predicate in inverse with the extraction from the subject for the inverse as well. That's what we get. We have the merging point, but as you see here, this element here is complete. It's bigger. So here you have a WH element, you have an island violation, but still is very small. It's just a DP. You also have your prepositional phrase. So looking at the content of the memory buffer, you have much more material here. And that's the material that may intervene in a very relevant way, which we don't have time much to discuss now. So at this point, since you already filled an element, which is the internal argument, you probably won't find any more space for discharging the content of the memory buffer. So extraction from the subject in inverse copular sentence is predicted to very even worse. Are the predictions somehow correct? Well, pretty much. So we fit our expectation with the standard model. Actually, the refinement in terms of relativized minimality is discussed in a paper with Paolo Canal, not with the extraction from island, but with standard cleft. So concluding remark, minimalists propose a very elegant structural building perspective, but it falls short in terms of transparency if you want to have a processing idea. So the performance might be influenced by many factors, but within this processing-friendly competence-based minimalist perspective, at least we obtain coherent expectation. That's what we want to add. The idea is that a simple asymmetry information between what you know in parsing and what you know in generation should produce the difference in parsing and generating, but relying exactly on the same structure. Last but not least, the copular construction are apparently very simple domain, but as you realize, they present all relevant ingredients and make our language faculty so tough to be replicated on a computer and hard to be investigated on the brain. So the upshot is that we don't want to solve problems before understanding them. Thank you very much.